Okay, just to continue from where we were before, I can't remember exactly where it cut me off, but I was talking about these new flats which Khrushchev had built in these new agri towns, as they were called. As I said, many of them are still all over Russia today. Today we'd probably look at them as like grotty 1960s flats. They weren't particularly well built. You can see on this picture actually how they look like they're prefabricated. But at the time, compared to where the peasants were living beforehand, they were a major improvement. You know, it's a bit of a private space. It's got its own bathroom. You've got your own living room, your own little bedrooms. Some of the mod cons will be in there as well. Electricity, for example. You may have had refrigerators in many of them. So a real kind of big increase in people's living conditions, I would say. Again, it has caused issues since, but much better than what was there before Khrushchev. So again, that shows that Khrushchev is making changes and probably improving the peasants' lives. Okay then, so let's change slides. Khrushchev also introduced something called the Virgin Land Scheme. This is nothing to do with trains, okay, or Richard Branson. This is extending agriculture into the Virgin Lands. And again, this has connotations with previous rulers. Remember Stolypin trying to increase agricultural land in Siberia by encouraging some peasants to go to Siberia. Alex II and Alex III also did the same, mainly in parts of places like Kazakhstan, places where lots of nomads lived. It was all part of their Russification scheme, this idea that peasants would leave kind of, land west of the Urals and go over to Kazakhstan, settle in that area, introduce the Russian language, introduce Russian Orthodoxy, etc., etc., and also introduce food as well and increase food production. So Khrushchev's motives, again, largely were down to increasing land and land under cultivation, but also there probably was an element as well of Russification as well. Having lots of these peasants in these kind of lightly populated areas. And we can see here some nice pictures that were done to kind of show Russification, trying to encourage peasants to move to these areas. So you've got the top left, for example, you've got that picture of a friendly looking tractor and some farmers there with lots of wheat, all looking nice and happy. And on the right hand side, I think they're stamps, and again it shows this agriculture, doesn't it, with tractors and corn and whatever else. There is a little video at the bottom, that YouTube video. I'll send out this PowerPoint to you all. If you click on that, it's a bit of propaganda from the 1950s and 60s. Don't be fooled, don't go out to Siberia on the Virgin Land Scheme as a consequence, but it does show you some nice images and how they try to encourage happy, healthy peasants to go to the Virgin Lands. So as I said, the plan was to encourage people to farm areas of Siberia and northern Kazakhstan, which were not under cultivation. This would produce more food. And this graph kind of shows you the agricultural product as a sense. So orange is grain produced on the Virgin Lands, blue is the total. And you can see from that blue line how there was an increase in production across Russia. Russia did produce more food in 1964 compared to 1954. But you can also see how uneven that is. So in 1957, there's a big decrease in land, food produced, in the Virgin Lands areas, and that also hit the overall kind of grain production of the Soviet Union. And again, 1963, there's a big problem as well. There's a real sharp drop in grain production. So again, although more grain is being produced, it does kind of show this graph how there were still big problems. Russia did not have like a stable kind of food production. There's a particular reason, by the way, for 1963, which I'll come to a little bit later on. And actually, you can see from the orange actually how initially there's a big increase of food from the Virgin Lands, but then it does kind of stay about the same, doesn't it, after that? It doesn't kind of rapidly increase any further. So the amount of extra produced was 20, wherever those units are on the left hand side. Okay, as I said, some of the problems you had is that, well, partly some of this land was virgin land, i.e. not under cultivation for a reason. In other words, these areas either had poor weather, poor soil, or both. And so how much extra land could you produce in those sorts of circumstances? So how much extra food could you produce in those circumstances? The areas which they were moving into had no infrastructure. So again, this is going to be expensive because you're going to have to build roads and railways to, get people there, produce, trains and stuff to take the food away which is being grown. It's going to need water supply, electricity supply, housing, etc., etc., etc. This isn't going to be cheap. So there's no infrastructure in these places, and they're a long way from kind of other areas. There's a shortage of fertilizer as well. Russia can only produce so much fertilizer because, again, a lot of the industry for Russia was aimed towards military, producing missiles and Sputnik and all that kind of jazz. So the amount of fertilizer Russia had was a little bit limited because it has to be manufactured. And again, these areas, because there's perhaps poor soil, are going to need a lot of fertilizer. And what you actually saw, as it says here, was you actually saw fertilizer in particular being diverted away from areas where there was already food production in some of the good lands to these virgin lands. So not only did it therefore see a decline in the amount of food produced in the good areas, but the amount of benefit they had in the virgin lands was perhaps not as comparable. And again, like I said to begin with, a lot of this comes down to lack of resources. If Khrushchev had had more freedom and more resources, he could actually produce a lot more fertilizer and therefore made sure, the rich agricultural land in the Ukraine had enough fertilizer, as did the virgin lands, but they didn't. Now, Khrushchev, he was very keen to boast about Russian production and how they're going to overtake the West. And one of his famous boasts he made was, "We will outproduce the USA in meat and milk production." So he set this target that the Soviet Union was going to produce more meat and more milk than the United States. And as a consequence, he set real high targets for meat production to the collective farms. I want you to produce, so many, pork chops or whatever. And these targets would have meant that Russia would have overtaken the USA in terms of meat production and milk production. What he also did, he actually visited the United States in, I can't remember exactly what the year was now, the late 1950s, and he was very impressed. In fact, I'm not sure this picture might have been from America and went to visit. Note how the corn's nearly as tall as he is. Anyway, when he went to the USA, he was amazed about the maize which they grew, this cereal crop. And a lot of maize in the United States is used to feed livestock, and therefore, if he's going to increase the meat production, he thought, I need to grow lots more maize. Again, this kind of, I'm an expert in agriculture. The main problem is the climate of Russia and the soil of Russia is not the same as the United States. So he encouraged all this maize to be grown across the United States, across the Soviet Union, to be used for livestock production. And that had two consequences. One, it meant less land was being produced to provide wheat to make bread for the people of Russia. Secondly, the climate and soil of Russia is not conducive to maize growing. And so the reason why that graph in 1962-63 see that big decline in food production was because that's the year they did all the maize. And the maize didn't grow very well, and there wasn't very much wheat. And so it led to hunger. And again, it links in, doesn't it, to that uprising that took place in the early 1960s in Novostelgrad, whatever it was called, because food prices had to go up. So that kind of shows some extent how Khrushchev didn't really think things through very well. Now, the other reform he was very keen on was to get rid of the machine tractor stations. Okay, these, I don't know what they're called, institutions, businesses, I'm not sure the right phrase is, these state-owned entities anyway, which lent out tractors and lent out fertilizer, spreading machines or whatever to the various collective farms. And Khrushchev was quite keen to get rid of them and instead transfer all the machines to the various collective farms. And actually there's a picture on the right hand side at the bottom which shows a typical collective farm. Okay, and on the top left you've got a machine tractor station there with some of the tractors. Now, in some ways, this makes sense, doesn't it? Because these machine tractor stations lent out the machinery at high cost to the various farms. The farms were paying over the odds to borrow in the machinery. It would be better, you might think, for them to have their own tractors and their own bits and bobs, so they didn't have to lease them out. So what Khrushchev did, he simply got rid of them. Okay, so virtually overnight they were kind of abolished. This led to some problems. The engineers who worked machine tractor stations, they were not keen to become employees of the collective farm. They much preferred their higher status as being state employees and being engineers for the state. And so what you found is many of the engineers who looked after the tractors and repaired the tractors left and they went back to the towns. This meant that the collective farmers, because they hadn't been repairing machines for 20, 30 years, whatever it was, they had no idea how to fix broken machinery. And so what it then led to was many machines which the engineers before would have fixed were left to go rusty in many barns because they didn't know how to fix them. Okay. Secondly, when they kind of sold off the equipment, so when the machine tractors were abolished, they weren't just given to the collective farms, they had to buy them, but many of them couldn't afford to buy the machinery. And as I said before, many of them couldn't afford the expense of repairing them. So what you basically saw was a lot of this machinery just went rusty. And so in some ways, this shows the lack of thought from Khrushchev. In some ways, abolishing the machine tractor stations is great, but actually it has these consequences. And he had no real answer to these consequences. And I suspect, again, this lack of money and resources might have played a part in this. If he'd had more resources, perhaps Khrushchev might have been able to abolish the machine tractor stations, but still ensure the engineers, got well paid as state employees on these collective farms instead. But for whatever reason, that didn't happen. Okay, and so as I said, this did not help food production because you had, more and more unreliable machinery, and also because the farmers couldn't buy any new machinery either. Okay, so I'm just aware of the time, got about a couple of minutes. So in terms of positives, he had a genuine interest in peasants and their conditions, and he often went to farms and stuff, as this picture here shows. And you could argue he did improve their living conditions with those new Khrushchev flats, and he did try, you might say, to improve their conditions by paying more for food. The relaxation of Stalin's policies did initially lead to an increase in food production. In terms of negatives, some of his big ideas like MTS and virgin land were not fully thought through, and they actually led to subsequent problems. But as I said, the main problem seems to have been lack of resources. You can also see with Khrushchev, I hope, some of the similarities with previous rulers. Again, for thinking about these essays. So you've got this idea, haven't you, of virgin lands from Alex II, Stolypin, and Khrushchev. Khrushchev perhaps being unusually interested in peasant conditions. Was Alex II interested in peasant conditions? To some extent, perhaps. Okay. But Khrushchev perhaps more so. And then there's clearly the differences with Khrushchev, isn't there? Especially with his two predecessors who didn't seem to like peasants very much and treated them really horribly. Khrushchev, at least, you might say, was quite unusual for a Russian leader in the fact he did seem to treat them reasonably well. But again, a bit like with Stolypin and Alex II, Khrushchev reforms didn't really have the big impact which he hoped. Didn't really have that transformative kind of results. Whether that's due to the Russian peasants being a little bit conservative, whether that's due to lack of resources, whether that's due to lack of time. These are all similarities between all of those rulers, isn't there, who tried to make reforms. And so again, Khrushchev and agriculture is an interesting topic and an important topic, well worthy to fit into essays.